Good morning. How are you all this morning? Good, good. That was a great start, don't you think? Yeah, fabulous. I'm Reverend Mary Shelton. I'm happy to welcome you this morning to Golden Gate Center for Spiritual Living. And I want you to know that whoever you are, wherever you may be on your pathway of faith, however long or briefly you've been coming, or if you've just been here for 10 minutes, wherever you are on your pathway of faith, you're welcome here. We're thrilled to have you. We're delighted. And this month of May, Centers for Spiritual Living, this is kind of our year of considering social justice, really, and being a presence in the world, individually and collectively, that is beneficial to the whole. So our theme for the month of May has been compassion and support for the poor. The poor. So that's an interesting question, wondering who the poor are. But before I go into that, I want to tell you a story. So last week, I told you a story about children, particularly one child and a cat. Today I have a story about one child and a whole bunch of kittens. So a 4-year-old boy was very excited to go with his daddy to the neighbor's house because he understood that there were newborn kittens over there, and he couldn't wait to see them. And so he went, and when he got home, he was so excited to tell his mom that there were 2 girl kittens and 4 boy kittens. Now, he was only 4 years old, so his mother said to him, well, and how did you know that there were two girl kittens and 4 boy kittens? And he said, well, Daddy picked them up and looked underneath. I think it's written on the bottom. When you're little, you do think logically, just not necessarily the way other folks do. So you have a wealth of possibilities, really a wealth of possibilities for how the universe works. Whereas once we become more trained in the world, we see through our eyes fewer possibilities. Not that there aren't more there, but we've kind of learned to look for the common ones. And so we might be missing something larger. Today we're asking the question, who are the poor? So we tend to go, I think, automatically to certain stereotypes in thinking about who the poor are. But if we look at it in a slightly larger context, we might say that you're poor when you are lacking what makes life rich and fulfilling. So it may be that you're experiencing loneliness. In your experience of poverty, it may be that you're experiencing homelessness or loneliness or a sense of being rejected or abandoned, without help. Sometimes what makes us poor is that we are experiencing fear, and that fear might be related to a genuine threat in our lives, or it might be a mental health fear. But fear can make us poor. It can bind us up. Hunger causes us to set aside our pride sometimes too. Make ourselves known as somebody who needs something. That can be an experience of poverty. Ill health can also be an experience of being poor. We can be rich in every way in our lives, but if our health is poor, then we're very limited. We're experiencing a limited life. Would you agree? This is also true if we have a loss of freedom. Whether that loss of freedom is because we're incarcerated, or we have addictions, or we have compulsions, or we have other issues, we can experience a kind of loss of our freedom, loss of our ability to make choices, to participate, to make a difference in the world. We begin to feel that we're maybe a little bit unnecessary or invisible. And the other thing that can make us poor is ignorance. Whether this ignorance is chosen or it's unintentional, ignorance can make us poor. Ignorance makes us poor because it reduces our choices. When we don't have sufficient information and education and the ability to see how things link up together, we can also be poor. So would you be willing to buy with me that all of these things can be expressions of some kind of poverty? Yes? Okay. So when we start with that, then we go to the question then of, am I invisible? Who actually notices? So I'm not necessarily speaking for you or for me, but we've all been in places where we have this feeling that we're invisible, that we're not anymore being responded to for some reason. And it depends on the circumstances who becomes invisible. So, you know, in our culture, if you're a white man, generally you're the most visible. And yet, in homeless situations, women and children are going to be seen and taken care of first, and the guys are kind of left for later. So gender and race sometimes are the first things that get evaluated in terms of whether somebody is seen as worthy or not. Then it can be age. So children may be prioritized, elderly may be prioritized, or they may be more invisible, depending on what the point of view is and what the circumstances are that we're coming from. Are you with me here so far? Is this making sense? Sometimes it's our level of capacity in terms of illness, mental or physical illness, or a deformity, or a disability of some sort. Sometimes it's our orientation or gender identity. So when we ask ourselves the question, who is worthy of help, then really it depends on how we're looking. But the question really then becomes, who isn't? Who isn't worthy of help? How are we looking? And what are we seeing? And how are we overlaying onto what we're seeing assumptions or judgments that make us view somebody else as less worthy of help? Samuel Smiles, who was a Scottish author and government reformer at the turn of the last century, said, "We learn wisdom from failure much more than from success. We often discover what we'll do by finding out what we'll not do. And probably he who never made a mistake never made a discovery." Sometimes the people who become the most powerful, the most helpful, the most transformative and uplifting to the rest of us are the ones who've made the worst mistakes, but been helped and found their way back. Can you relate to that? Yeah. Now, in the Fairness campaign, I think it's Lynn Twist said, epidemiological studies show that in countries with a giant income disparity between the very rich and the very poor, both suffer from higher rates of ill health, crime, mental illness, environmental problems, and violence. In other words, when life is unfair, you and I both lose, no matter how wealthy either of us is. Everyone's experience of life is diminished by having a huge disparity between what's available to people in terms of equity and justice and abundance and what isn't. Our founder, Ernest Holmes, in speaking of us as religious scientists, as practicing people in the science of mind who are working to be a beneficial presence, but also to see with eyes of love, with eyes of divinity. He says if we're dealing directly with disease, poverty, or unhappiness, we would be caught in its mental vibration. Now, let me say what he means by that, because he isn't saying don't engage with it, because you'll be caught in its mental vibration. He's saying something much more complex. He's saying see through the appearance to the spiritual truth. Because when you are focused on the spiritual truth, you can engage with the person and the situation without getting caught in the desperateness or the troublesomeness or the complexity of that person or their situation. And so, let me say that again. If we're dealing directly with disease, poverty, or unhappiness, directly with the condition, that is, believing in it as a solid thing, we would be caught in its mental vibration. We should seek to disentangle our imagination from the material person and join it with our contemplation of the spiritual person. In other words, one of my mentor ministers years ago went to visit somebody in the hospital, and she hadn't had time to do her preparation work before she went, her prayer work. And she said, when she came back to the office, she was rattled, and she said to her secretary, "I'm sorry, I have to go into my office and shut the door. I just saw a sick person." What she meant by that was she went to visit this person in the hospital, and she could not center herself to see through the appearance of the illness that they were experiencing. The illness, the visible expression of it, profoundly shook her to such a degree she couldn't see the person through the illness. Do you know what I mean by this? Yeah? So sometimes we do it with our children. You know, they're very upset about something, but when they're really little and we're grown-ups, sometimes we recognize that that thing is not as serious as it seems to them in the moment. That in a moment, it will start to be better, and then they will get through it. Even though for them in this now moment, it's the biggest terrible thing that's ever happened. So the infinite can look through what look like terrible, dire circumstances that we're in and see through to the power of the spiritual presence that we are, without being fooled by the appearance. And so we are invited in the science of mind to practice seeing the spiritual truth and looking beyond that powerful, distressing appearance that we're looking at. This is what our classes are about. This is what our practice is about, is learning how we do that and how to practice it so that it happens more automatically when we're confronted with a crisis. And then a little later in the science of mind, Ernest Holmes says, the whole purpose of the science of mind is to reconcile the apparent separation of the spiritual world, which must be perfect, with the material world, which appears imperfect. One of the things to recognize when we're engaging with our life in this way and looking at the appearances that are in front of us is recognizing that everything that we experience in our lives in form is transitory. There isn't anything in form that is permanent in form. It will go through a transformation sooner or later. It will energetically become something else. It won't last in its current form. It just won't. Because that's not what form is about. Form isn't meant to be permanent. It's a constantly creative, evolving expression of divine presence in every manifestation we can imagine, both those we label positive and those we label negative. So then, if everyone is worthy of help, then we have an overwhelming problem, which is, but how can we possibly help them all? How can we possibly do it? How can we make a difference for the whole planet? How can we uplift the consciousness of all those people and situations? So what would support look like? What would support look like? For us as a community, what would support look like? For us as individuals engaging in the world with those who are temporarily struggling with a condition or circumstance, even if temporarily means a chronic experience for their lifetime, it's still temporary. What does that look like? So the first thing we can do is material help, because people have to be able to have their subsistence needs met in order to be available to grow in any other way. They have to have food and shelter and clothing. And sometimes, for some of us, the best way that we can be available to somebody else is to donate that or to donate money. Sometimes that's what we can do. That's one way that we respond and support. Another way is emotional. By beginning to provide people, no matter what the appearance of their circumstance is, with respect. And to support them in their emotional well-being by seeing the truth of who they are through the appearance. Maybe we're therapists or doctors, and we have the opportunity to support people with some of those challenges in actually helpful ways. So that might be the way in which we are able to do it individually. Another kind of support is spiritual. Prayer is profoundly supportive when it isn't meant to be an excuse for not taking action. When we offer thoughts and prayers, but it's really just lip service, and it's a substitute for engagement, then we're not really doing the prayer work. Would you agree? The prayer work comes from a different place. The prayer work comes from a deep place of offering the truth we know to that situation from within our own consciousness. It is a work we do on ourselves, but because we're all connected, it has the possibility of uplifting the one who needs it most when the prayer is offered for them. And it is a way of supporting their connection with God, not just by sharing with somebody else what you may believe about God, but by coming from that place when you're with them. I think I've told you before that a long time ago when I was the minister in Santa Rosa and we had all our kids, we had tons of kids in youth church, and we had a preschool section for all the little babies and toddlers. And in that section, we had a gal who was an early childhood educator, and I remember saying to her, I'm sorry that we don't have curriculum to give you for the babies and the toddlers like we do for the kids that are older to help them with the science of mind concepts and philosophy. And she said, oh no, Reverend Mary, we have a wonderful curriculum. The curriculum we have for the babies and the toddlers is how we are with them. We are living our philosophy, and that's the way we treat them, and that's how we teach them what life is about and who they are and who we are. So supporting another person in their connection with God sometimes is not about what we say to them. It's about the way we are with them and the way we give them an opportunity to be because of how we are with them. Does that make sense? Okay? So that spiritual connection is another way that we can individually and collectively be supportive. And then relationally, helping people to reconnect with themselves, with other people, with creation, with God, helping them to heal and reestablish relational connections. So for example, somebody's in a 12-step program and they're new, and you're in a 12-step program and you're not so new, then you know that what they're doing in their practicing of the 12 steps is they're rebuilding their connections to those things. And you, from having a little more recovery, can be a supportive, grounding presence that says, you can do this. This is possible. I've done it, and I was a mess, so you can do it. So there is an avenue where we might be of support. We can also be advocates. We may have information that needs to get to legislators. We may have information that needs to get to the larger community, or experience that we can share that makes a difference. We need to show up in those cases, to stand up, to speak up, to be an advocate for people who sometimes can't speak for themselves or aren't clear enough to be able to find the words to actually do that. We want to support equity and justice for people who are disenfranchised in some fashion, for whatever category they may be in, of the ones that I read earlier or other ones. So sometimes we show up as advocates, individually or collectively. I had a friend when I was in graduate school whose son, a person of color, had wound up in prison for a drug offense. He was coming up for a parole hearing. And she said to some of us who were her friends, white people who were her friends, she said, if you will come to the courthouse in Marin and show up with me for him, it will have more weight because you are there in support of him. Now, whether that's right or wrong, what she was asking us to do was to be supportive advocates, because our presence advocated something deeper and larger than she felt she could do just with family and friends who were people of color. Unfortunately, that's not a situation we want to have be that way, but sometimes stepping up and being an advocate can make a difference, just because of what you look like. And finally, empowering people. Empowering them by teaching, maybe, teaching skills, not just sending them out into the world and saying, okay, now you're cleaned up, or now you've been released from prison. Now you go out there and you live what you've learned, live it well. And they have 10 cents and no job and no place to live. And, how do you go from 0 to 100 in 1 second, or in 1 day, or in 1 week when you're coming back? You need skills, you need support, you need all of those things, teaching, training, without judgment. It's very hard to put yourself in that position to learn again when you have to go into an environment where you always feel less than or smaller. And I think a lot of people who do this kind of work of teaching and training have learned how to do it without judgment, just as a presence, one human being to another, to be supportive and to pray with them if they want that, or for them if they want that. And so what we need to be able to do sometimes in order to recognize that we have something to offer in the way of support, and that we can also look beyond our blinders to see the value in that person, to really see the value in that person. When I lived in Southern California in Huntington Beach, I had a congregant who had worked at Disneyland, like Reverend Carroll did, except in 1960. And he sent, bless you, he sent this story to me about his experience. He said, a quiet winter morning had cleared from an early rain to crisp blue skies. Main Street was nearly deserted, and all of Disneyland had a fresh, sparkling look. I was 21 years old, and I liked working in the Hallmark card store. The year was 1960. Disneyland had been open about 5 years, and I felt very privileged to have such a good job. A customer had just left, and the store was empty. I was making a routine check of the stock on display when a middle-aged man came in the side door. He casually looked around, sauntered down the aisle, and ended up in the rear of the shop looking over the new party favors. At almost the same time, a very well-groomed, mature woman dressed in an expensive suit and high heels, boy, nobody dresses like that to go to Disneyland anymore, do they? Entered the front door and asked for the location of the postcards. As she leafed through the cards, she told me what a thrill it was visiting Disneyland. She and her family had traveled from somewhere in the Midwest just to see this wonderful place. After several more very complimentary remarks about the park and some small talk about her hometown, she turned toward the man who had just entered before her and said, "My only disappointment here is that there isn't some sort of dress code enforced at the gate. Obviously, any person who has the price of a ticket can be admitted." It was apparent she was referring to the appearance of my only other customer. He was dressed in slightly soiled tan pants, had a day-old beard. However, his hair was combed, his shirt was clean. The man must have heard her remarks, but he just continued to look at the party favors. And I wanted to say to the lady, "Take a second look." But I knew that that one simple statement would be inappropriate and out of the question. She paid for her postcards and rejoined the few people on Main Street. The man smiled at me and went out just as he had entered. Too bad that lady didn't lay aside her ideas about how things should be. If she had taken that second look, she might have turned her disappointment into an experience she could remember a lifetime. Her prejudice blinded her, and she never got to meet the man in the back of the store, Walt Disney. Good story. You see, snap judgment has a way of becoming unfastened. It has a way of becoming unfastened. It's important for us to then be able to put aside our prejudice blinders, those blinders that gave us the opportunity to see things a certain way and to learn how things worked in the world, become an obstacle to us seeing what's in front of us sometimes, the larger truth. What is the opportunity that's available in the midst of this difficult challenge that I'm facing or that someone else is facing that I might enter into and help with? So we learn that it is useful to teach somebody to fish more so than just to give them a fish. Now, to give them a fish if they're hungry, that's essential. That charity is where we have to start, but that's not a permanent solution, because then you just end up, giving a lot of fish away, but having people who don't have the skill to go out and fish. So teaching someone a skill, something that you know how to do, can be very helpful to them in establishing a life that works. One of the reasons that I like tithing to organizations that are not just charity, but that actually give somebody a skill or an ability or a talent or empowerment, I like that, because what they're doing is they are recognizing the potential in that person and lifting it up in such a way that the other person can see it and experience for himself or herself. So the Heifer Project, which gives farm animals to small families that are disadvantaged all over the world, allowing them to start raising food and to multiply those animals and sell them to others in their villages and lift the prosperity of everybody who's there, as well as feed their families. Or Habitat for Humanity, which teaches people carpentry skills and building skills. So they not only build their own house, but now they have a skill. They have a potential trade, even, if they wanted it, to go forward further from there. And so what we want is to be able to empower people to make a meaningful contribution. We are meaning makers, just like the little kid who said he was, his dad was reading the label on the bottom. He was too little to read, but he figured that's how daddy knew the gender of the kittens. We are meaning makers. We look at what we see in the world and we make decisions about what we think they mean. And lots of times those decisions are just assumptions, really. When Jesus said, "Judge not according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment," use your judgment, your discernment rightly, correctly. See what's true, not what appears. See what's real, not what's temporary. And so we want to be able to provide, if necessary, and it's something we can do, education. We want to be able to give somebody the opportunity for engagement by helping them. And we want to empower them to go forward in a way that makes a difference, that they can feel that makes a difference. Does this make sense? Does this seem reasonable? If you have been in a situation where you once upon a time, maybe only once, one day out of your life, you really needed help, how many of you got it when you needed it? Okay, so that's quite a few. That's quite a few. And I'm going to suspect that if you look deeper, it would be everybody. We all got help sometime when we really needed it. And so the torch gets passed on to us. Not that we haven't been helping people, of course we do, but just to be reminded that we're called to that. We're called to participating in a bigger way. A psychologist who was teaching stress management to an audience had a glass of water, and she held it up like this, and everyone thought they were going to be asked, okay, is the glass half empty or half full? But instead, with a smile on her face, she asked them, how heavy is this glass of water? And the answers called out range from 8 ounces to 20 ounces. And she replied, the absolute weight doesn't matter. It depends on how long I hold it. If I hold it for a minute, it's not a problem. If I hold it for an hour, I'll have an ache in my arm. If I hold it for a day, my arm will feel numb and paralyzed. In each case, the weight of the glass doesn't change, but the longer I hold it, the heavier it becomes. And she continued, the stresses and worries in our lives are like this glass of water. Think about them for a while and nothing happens. Think about them a bit longer and they begin to hurt. And if you think about them all day long, you'll feel paralyzed, incapable of doing anything. Remember to put the glass down. Well, sometimes we need help putting the glass down. Sometimes we need others to help us put the glass down, and sometimes it takes longer to put the glass down than we thought. I came across a story on the internet this morning as I was cruising through morning stories about a fellow in India who, some years ago now, went out to the beach in Mumbai, a beach that was absolutely, for a huge distance, covered with trash. Just completely covered with trash. And he started picking it up. Now, really, can you think of a more futile, less rewarding task than to trying to pick up trash out of acres of trash? He got a few people engaged in helping him. And then he got a few more engaged until it kind of became like a viral idea, and more people started to show up. And they got the trash actually removed from that beach so that 2 years later, for the first time in something like 20 years, the little hatching turtles showed up to walk from their places where they hatched out to the sea. They hadn't been able to do that in Mumbai for decades. And now his project has encompassed 2 beaches and all kinds of other areas. This is a project that was started because one person had an idea and decided to try and make a difference. But he didn't do it alone. He didn't try to go out there and clean the whole beach by himself. He started to talk to people who came to ask him about it. And kids from schools began to come and get involved in the project. He began to speak about the difference that was happening, and more people came. So sometimes we think that something is overwhelming, and it's impossible for us to make a difference because we're just one person. Mother Teresa said, I am one person. I can only do small things, but I can do small things with great love. And so we too, if we do small things with great love, if we do them in a way that we're willing to share with others and invite them into that with us, who knows what could happen in the world? But the clue is, the key is to start where we are, with who we're with, and what we're best able to do. We don't have to do everything for everyone. We don't all of us have to do the same things. We're just called to do what's right in front of us with who we're with right now and do what we can. Is that something we can do? Yes. I think so too. Let's do that. Namaste.